The essay here discusses Mary during the quarter century she spent as woman, wife, and mother in Springfield within the context of both Victorian society and culture in general. I think the result, and again you be the judge, is a more objective portrait of Mary Lincoln's pre-presidential life. In a chapter by Douglas L. Wilson, William H. Herndon, and Mary Todd Lincoln, Wilson examines the basis for two related and widely held beliefs. One, that William Herndon, Lincoln's last law partner and biographer, hated his partner's wife, Mary Lincoln, and two, that because of his personal antagonism, Herndon offered a colored or falsified picture of her in his biographical writings. The first belief, especially when represented as a lifelong antagonism going back to their first meeting, is shown by Wilson to have a very questionable basis and to lack corroboration with the evidence that's available. The second belief is the more consequential because of the position Herndon occupies. Not only is the joint author with White of what has been called the most influential biography of Abraham Lincoln, but as the compiler of by far the most extensive archive of personal information about Lincoln on record. Thus, Wilson has a different take than Kenneth Winkle on how biased this evidence collected about Mary was. Winkle tilts towards the bias argument. Wilson believes that it's probative evidence. It also puts Wilson at odds with Miller on the happiness of Lincoln's home life. According to Wilson, the evidence indicates the outbreak and development of an open and genuine conflict between Herndon and Mary Lincoln, not early in their relationship, but the year after Lincoln's assassination, with justifiable reasons for hostility on both sides. Her appetite, I think we know well, for consumer goods and her reputation for extravagant spending, both of which gained momentum during the White House years, would continue to haunt her for her entire life. In addition to consumer goods, Mary also spent money on travel. Unlike many of her generation, Mary Lincoln was fond of sojourns. So in Dr. Wayne Temple's chapter, I Am So Fond of Sightseeing, Mary Lincoln's Travels up to 1865, Wayne Temple explores Mary's break with tradition and explores what her interest in traveling says about her vision of her role as First Lady. We see here, again, that Mary was well ahead of her time in many ways and foreshadowed later First Ladies who travel the world. Mary's life was congruent with the widespread use of the steamboat and railroad. And Temple takes the reader on a journey with Mary around the country. The fact that some of the other essays in the book sees Mary Lincoln more as a homebody and Temple sees her more as someone who loves travel shows yet again how enigmatic Mary was. Mary also loved to entertain, particularly when she was, as so often happened, one of the only women present in a social gathering. However, her lavish White House parties were at odds with the mood of the country, which was consumed by the Civil War. Criticized as unrefined because of her upbringing in the West, she often chose colors and styles not considered appropriate for her age and figure. And she continually refused to retire into the background, as had so many other presidential wives. So Donna McCrary, in her chapter, examines Mary's wardrobe, which was quite extensive, and her fashion, and discusses whether Mary was a trendsetter or a fashion disaster. Like much else that she did, Mary did not confine her exchange of favors on behalf of the men in her family, but she dared to mine the political waters with her husband, seeking patronage appointments from him when she could. Since the 1990s, it has been almost axiomatic that in Lincoln literature, that one of the most important aspects of Mary and Abraham's relationships is that they form a political partnership, and that Lincoln was much taken with Mary's advice, which she would often give. Well, how true is that? What exactly does the term political partnership mean? Did the Lincolns share an ambition for his advancement? Did Lincoln's marriage further his political career? Did the Lincolns agree on politics? Most importantly, did Lincoln follow Mary's political advice? Well, in Michael Berkheimer's chapter, The Reports of the Lincolns' Political Partnership Have Been Greatly Exaggerated, Michael attempts to clarify this important political aspect of the Mary Lincoln Enigma, and he reaches differing conclusions about Mary's importance in Lincoln's political success than Kenneth Winkle's essay, which suggests the debates about this subject are not going to die anytime soon. The greatest loss of her life occurred on April 14, 1865, when an assassin's bullet fatally wounded her husband seated at her side at Ford's Theater. Prostrated with grief, which she had never known how to handle anyway, she took to her bed for more than a month, refusing to vacate the White House for Lincoln's successor. When she finally did arrive, she donned the heavy Victorian black mourning that she would wear for the rest of her life. The shock of the assassination perhaps ultimately led to one of the most controversial aspects of Mary's life, her insanity trial in Chicago and her confinement to a sanatorium in Batavia. Dr. James S. Bruce writes, "A psychiatrist looks at Mary Lincoln. He examines the medical aspects of Mary, reviews the existing literature written by physicians, and presents a psychiatric diagnosis for her. Bruce provides a robust defense of psychiatry and its uses in history. He rightfully admits that without Mary actually being present to examine, all of his conclusions can only be tentative." Now there's an honest man. But he does come to the conclusion, and I tend to agree with this because of her irrationality, that she did suffer from mental illness. The years following Lincoln's death were difficult for her, and not just because of her confinement. The executor of the estate, who was Justice Davis of our Supreme Court, found herself forced to exist on a very small allowance. That led to her effort, ill-fated, remember, of trying to sell her wardrobe, and it was supposed to be done discreetly, except the media got a hold of it, and you know what happened there. In 1871, Tad died. Her estrangement from Robert increased, and she was unable to find a suitable home. In addition to her deteriorating physical state, she used certain drugs, opiates, that may have accentuated her peculiarities and actions, such as excessive mourning and her use of shopping as a therapy for boredom and grief. Well, there are some in this room that would use shopping as therapy. I'm not going to mention any names, but I see a couple here. The ultimate indignity visited upon her occurred when Robert decided that his mother's, he called it irritating behavior, must be caused by insanity, and with the help of a few obliging male doctors and lawyers, he dragged his mother into court and had her committed to a genteel asylum, Bellevue in Batavia. Just one thing about the trial. Most states committed people who were thought to be suffering from mental illness without even a hearing. Illinois was for a couple of years, did require a hearing before anyone was committed, and a finding by a judge before committal. And this is good. This is good as part of the right to have a hearing and due process. But once that hearing was held, in Mary's case, there was very little due process. The fix was in with the people who were involved in the hearing. So she really didn't get the due process that we would expect today, at least, from anyone in our courts who are alleged to have these kinds of problems. But within 3 months, and with the help of one of America's first female lawyers, Myra Bradwell, Mary left Bellevue to live with her sister Elizabeth, yet again in Springfield. This experience, however, caused irreparable damage to her relationship with Robert. Now, Jason Emerson, who is very familiar with the Lincoln family, having done the first major biography on Robert Lincoln in 50 years. And the book's available here, I think, in the Cottage bookshop. He's also looked again at the trial, and he's published a book of original source material relating to the insanity trial. He writes a chapter in our book, The Mary Lincoln Enigma, discussing and examining the relationship between Mary and her oldest son. I Miss Bob So Much is the title of the chapter. And this relationship was one of the most important in all of Mary's life. And the author studies and does such a superb job. He studies the misunderstandings, misrepresentations, and documentation employed by previous historians and biographers. Emerson stresses the often very positive relationship that the two had over conventional views, which focused primarily on the negative way the insanity trial affected their relationship. Since her death, her life has become a subject that novelists have looked to. She is a story waiting for a time to be told. So Richard Etulain, in one of our chapters, Mary Lincoln Among the Novelists, Fictional Interpretations of a First Lady, examines how fiction writers have treated Mary Lincoln in literature. And the author seeks to see if there have been any discernible interpretive trends from the early novels about Mrs. Lincoln to those published in the last 20 years. Our Harold Holzer, no book would be complete without his contribution, writes about the Mary Lincoln image, and he examines the visual accompaniment to the Mary Lincoln literature, the iconography of Mary Lincoln, and how her image has been reflected in popular culture and memory. And to wrap it all up, we have Catherine Clinton's epilogue, herself a Mary Lincoln biographer. The title is Mrs. Lincoln. She reflects on the larger questions in our study about this controversial First Lady. She incorporates some of the materials given by the authors, other authors in the book, and it really is her meditation on what draws scholars to this topic and how it causes such wildly fluctuating interpretations of Mary. So she's had to come down on one side or the other because of the differences that I briefly told you about. And she attempts to evaluate the sometimes dramatic differences between the essays in the volume, thus explaining, with the other contributors, the Mary Lincoln Enigma. Thank you very much.